Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to another early morning meeting of Howard County Fiscal 24 Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. We have a packed agenda today covering very important information. We'll start with the school system led by Dr. Matarana with a presentation on schools operating and CIP budget. And then we will take a quick vote on the HOCO by design fiscal impact analysis from this committee as a special charge of this year's executive order. Then myself will go over fiscal outlook preliminary version and together with the multi-year projections. And then that will be followed up by my colleagues at Finance Department, talk about credit rating update as well as debt indicators there. So hopefully we'll find the information informative. So Dr. Matarana and your team, your place. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everybody. It is early morning, and we always seem to have a problem with WebEx in terms of our signing on. So I'm going to remain just with voice today and no video so that I don't cause any further problems with my connection. So good morning again, and I appreciate this opportunity to present the fiscal year 2024 proposed capital and operating budgets to the Spending and Affordability Advisory Committee. And first of all, let me thank you for all that you do for the oversight of our finances within Howard County. And I will briefly touch on the FY24 capital budget and then transition to the operating budget. Looking briefly ahead at our capital budget process, I wanted to provide a glimpse of the major projects that are underway and what will be opening next school year. We are very fortunate while this beautiful new Talbot Springs Elementary School building opened this year, the remaining work site, including stormwater management ponds and site plantings, continue this spring. We're all excited about new High School 13. Eventually, we will have a name here in the next month. Is continuing in construction on both the building and the site with the completion of the schedule for the late spring and early summer to be ready for next school year. And we've got everything going to get ready for that first day of school. Hammond High School renovation, as many of you know, the renovation and the addition continues. As phases of this project are completed and able to be occupied, we have turned them over to the school for use. The project is scheduled to be substantially completed by the end of this summer, with a few remaining portions finishing up next school year. Manor Woods Elementary is receiving a full systemic renovation of the HVAC system is in the beginning stages of design. This project is intended to be a multi-year phase project with work happening over multiple summers. And again, additional projects are being worked on and completed by Building Maintenance Office through prior appropriations and new requests in the systemic renovation modernization line of the capital budget. These projects primarily focus on maintenance and replacement scopes of the work. It's always a reminder that our schools are aging and that we need to keep up with the renovations as well. Looking ahead at the long-range master plan, there was a good bit of community engagement a few months ago, and the next projects on the docket include a renovation and an addition at Oakland Mills Middle and High Schools, a renovation and addition at Dunlogan Middle School, new Elementary School 43 to continue to address our ongoing growth, and Centennial High School renovation and addition. The chart in this slide also details the remainder of the projects in the plan through the 2033, I did say 33 fiscal year, which takes us over the next 10 years. Now, that's just a brief overview of our capital process, and there's a lot of information I could share with you if I had several hours just to go through that process. But now I want to quickly go through the FY24 operating budget that I presented to the Board of Education last week. Members of the Board of Education, County Council, and County Government have continually asked me for the needs of the school system to be clearly articulated. And this budget does just that, and it is our opportunity as a system to articulate our priorities. And I want this group to understand several points that I will continue to make this morning. At this point, we do not know the exact level of funding that we should expect to receive from the county, but it is incumbent upon me as superintendent to identify our needs and seek adequate funding for the rising number of unnegotiable state mandates and the level of services that our school provides, which makes Howard County and a destination school district for so many families. In fact, Maryland state law, and I want to remind everybody this, Maryland state law says that the county superintendent shall, one, take the initiative in preparation and presentation of the annual school budget, And 2, seek in every way to secure adequate funds from local authorities for the support and development of the public schools within the county. And we are at this major inflection point that I continue to talk about to our board members and community. As you will see throughout this presentation, our primary focus is, as we have constructed this thoughtful budget request, is on the academic achievement and continued recovery of students following COVID-19. Every decision we made has been done so through this lens. We remain steadfast and ambitious in our educational goals for our children. These goals inform and compel us to deliver a broad array of instruction for student success, along with essential supports for their social and emotional well-being. And there is no question that our students have regressed both academically and emotionally in these last several years, and we do need to do everything that we can to bring them back up to where they need to be. The proposed FY24 operating budget articulates the needs of the Howard County Public School System, so all students and staff have the greatest opportunities to succeed while ensuring the fiduciary responsibility over a budget that is largely funded by the taxpayers of Howard County. And we recognize that as an extremely focused point of our budget development. This budget aligns with best practices for budget development and fiscal accountability and prioritizes the most urgent needs of our students and families. Additionally, it aligns to the strategic call to action, learning and leading with equity, and incorporates the blueprint for Maryland's future. And many of you have been briefed on that over the last few years, as this is a major lift for the state of Maryland as it also pertains to Howard County and the budget process. In short, as I've stated before, this is not an aspirational budget, but one that has been thoughtfully considered through the exemplary work of system budget managers to identify our greatest needs. And I want to make clear that while we do not project significant rise in enrollment next year, state mandates and the heightened expectations for schools to fulfill the essential growing needs of our community requires an increase in the level of funding we must receive from the county. Now, the blueprint for Maryland Future has been a point of discussion for several years, as I just alluded to. In the last year, we saw the very beginning of funding being required to implement the state mandated legislation. This year, the funding levels must increase much more to meet the requirements of the legislation, and this will only continue to grow as we reach full implementation in the years ahead. The FY24 budget includes required increases in compensation, and that is a major piece in terms of our recruitment and retention of our teachers and staff. Included in this is funding for the National Board Certification, pay in alignment with the blueprint pillar that cultivates high quality and diverse teachers and leaders. Interest in young people entering the education profession is diminishing, and that is real. It is affecting Howard County every day. So it is imperative that we continue to recognize effective teachers and school leaders and incentivize them to stay in the classroom. And how do we do that is with our competitive salaries. At this point in time, I just want to make an aside to let people know that we are aggressively approaching that. And right now we are number 2 currently in the state of Maryland for our starting first year teachers. This is an expectation that we get to 60,000 in the next several years, and we are well on our way to do so with our negotiated agreements. The blueprint pillar for college and career readiness pathway requires significant funding allocated to Workforce Development Board, and more students are expected to participate in dual enrollment opportunities, which must now be fully funded by the school system. And we're very proud of our Jumpstart program and our dual enrollment program in partnership with Howard Community College. Another blueprint pillar specifically related to early childhood education results in the expansion of full-day pre-K next school year as well. And these and other requirements will require significant increases in staffing, resources, and many operational costs and are non-negotiable. Beginning with this year's budget, the funding requirement for the blueprint are interwoven throughout the budget as various programs adopt certain portions of the legislation. It is important to note that while our enrollment may not be increasing at the same pace as prior years, the blueprint requirements are independent of enrollment, and the implementation of this transformational legislation is critical. And I've stated to my board on numerous occasions, it is the law and these are non-negotiable, and we have to address them as we implement these over the next several years. Now, members of this committee, as I've stated before, and while our enrollment growth has slowed, our requirements to fully support our students have rapidly increased. we will see that the budget priority services and supports that must be increased to meet the need, this higher need. And based on the most recent data, I'm here to provide some very alarming and shocking news for us as Howard Countyans. We learned that the rate of students who participate in free and reduced meals over the last several years has increased from 26.88% to now the all-time high of 30.1% this year. And keep in mind that translates to about 17,000 students, and an increase of approximately 2,000 just in the last year. And we always need to keep our eye on this particular data point as it defines the increased level of poverty that our students are experiencing in Howard County. This legislation mandates of the blueprint for Maryland's future are incorporated throughout this proposed budget, including items, as I've stated, related to the expansion of the NBCT, which is the National Board Certification, dual enrollment funding requirements, and the expanded pre-K, which are major pillars of the blueprint. Additionally, adequate funding is included for the opening and staffing of the 13th high school. Additionally, necessary student mental health positions, staff compensation increases, school safety positions, transportation staffing required to implement anticipated new school start times, and rapidly rising inflation, contractual costs and utilities, and continuing to overcome multiple years of impacts on learning loss and supports experienced as a result of COVID-19. I can't be much more clear in terms of our focus priorities. These define the work every day. We know that what we are doing in our schools is working because our students are realizing achievement and success in school and beyond graduation. We are comfortable that we maintain and even improve high levels of achievement as we scaffold in the requirements of the blueprint on the comprehensive support services and high levels of instruction that are already in place throughout a student's journey. And we view this as a critical journey with every grade level mattering in terms of the student's performance. And as you can see, I always bring this point out for our community to understand. As you can see, most of our operating budget is in an investment in our staff. Nearly 84% of our total budget, which translates to $958 million of our budget, goes directly to our 9,331 employees by way of salary and benefits. We are the top employer in Howard County, and we believe that an investment in quality educators and staff is an investment in our students. We take care of the people who take care of our students. Approximately 5% of the total budget is attributed directly to student transportation, and 11.4% represents non-personnel operational, curricular, and special educational costs. So you can see the large portion goes to the people in our community, in our school system community who support our students every day. The proposed FY operating budget totals $1.14 billion, representing a 10.5% increase over the current FY23 operating budget. While that is a significant increase, and I recognize that, every dollar of the increase has been carefully vetted and considered and aligns directly to the priorities that I've talked about thus far of the thousands of students and families we serve and the mandates of the state legislation. This budget is constructed in a responsible manner and is aligned to the budgeting and best practices detailed in the legislative and external financial audits that have been conducted. This budget proposal eliminates an overdependency on leveraging fund balance and folds in expiring grants funding so those critical programs may continue. Additionally, this budget refrains from the practice that led to future deficits after finally eliminating the multi-year health fund deficit and realizes a positive fund balance this fiscal year. If I haven't said that enough, we have fully eliminated the healthcare deficit and we are realizing a positive fund balance this fiscal year, something critically important to the overall management of our finances. To more clearly illustrate the budget priorities supported within this $1.14 billion budget, the chart shows $108.5 million of budget growth by the priorities and needs of the school system. The priorities fall into 6 groupings, which have been articulated in my previous comments, but let me just define those further for us for focus. Employee compensation, strategically investing in student achievement, crucial needs for school system management and operations, financial obligations and commitments, the opening of High School 13, and the overall enrollment commitments. Necessary employee compensation increases account for 44% of that growth, with the bulk of the remaining growth being driven by state-mandated legislation. I've already stated the opening of High School 13, which will open with 2 grade levels, with approximately 800 students, and each year we will phase in each grade level, which will require more staffing needs as we continue over the next several fiscal years. Staffing for special education. We have more students within that particular area, and we need to make certain that our most vulnerable students are taken care of. Reading in other areas of student success crucial to the needs in school management and operations, and our growing financial obligations and commitments are significantly important and recognized within this budget. Finally, I want to emphasize, and I want you all to take a look at this graphic. This defines our overall journey that we have defined for our student from birth through the process of graduation and beyond. I want to emphasize that this budget is driven by this entire journey. A student travels from the time they enter our schools until the time they leave and embark upon the rest of their lives. This is a graphical representation of the student's journey we have been using as a guide to implement focused and intentional instructional practices, supports, and measurements with the ultimate goal of every student achieving. Our operating budget is our first opportunity to detail our priorities heading in to next school year, so it is appropriate that we align our fiscal priorities with our instructional and operational priorities. Nothing is left to chance. The primary focus of the student's journey is to be sure that every student achieves. From birth through pre-kindergarten, it is imperative that all students are prepared for kindergarten. Learning to read is prioritized in the elementary early years, and then gaining proficiency in English language arts, math, and science continue through middle school. In high school, we strive for all students to be college and career ready, and ultimately, as we all would expect as Howard Countyans, life ready for the future that awaits them. As we have seen from our recent assessment data, more needs to be done. To successfully accomplish this, the Howard County Public School System has established a comprehensive birth through 12 experience that is entirely dependent on making sure all the staffing, resources, and supports and opportunities are available and effective for every student. Only when these fundamental elements are in place and delivered by a full complement of expert staff can we truly realize every student achieving. At this point, Dr. Sun, I'm now going to hand this over to Darren Conforti, who will also briefly provide additional understanding of the revenues. So thank you to members of this group this morning for listening. And Darren, I'm now going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Martirano. Good morning, Dr. Sun, members of the Spending Affordability Committee. As Dr. Martirano indicated, I'm Darren Conforti, and the Executive Director of Budget. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the revenues and what's going on with the revenue changes for fiscal year 24 in the superintendent's proposed budget. As the superintendent stated earlier, the total revenue requirements for this budget have to balance to the expenditure requirements. So the total proposed revenues are $1.14 billion. This is an increase of $108.5 million, or 10.5% from the current approved budget. And as you can see on the pie chart to the right side of this screen, state and county revenues make up 99% of the revenues that's received by the school system. Both of these revenues are proposed to increase for the next year based on the amounts you see in the table before you. The state funding is going up about $27.3 million. The county revenue is proposed to increase $109.6 million. And let me drill down a little bit on that particular number. There are 3 components driving the change in the county revenue, and there's a breakout at the bottom of the screen that articulates these. The required maintenance of effort funding amount is declining by $24.5 million. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The above MOE request is $130.5 million, and then there's a request for additional one-time funding in the amount of $3.6 million. So together, these make up the $109.6 million change in the proposed revenues from the county for fiscal year 24. Also want to point out that what you can see on this summary table is there is no use of fund balance in the proposed FY24 budget. And this is, of course, a very positive thing, as these dollars are one-time monies and have to be replaced in subsequent years. But the key point on this slide that we want to discuss is that the required amount of state funding is increasing and the required amount of county funding is decreasing. In addition, throughout this, the explanation we hope to explain is the impact that this is having on the overall operating budget revenue. So let me explain that a little bit further. The funding for the state and the county are calculated using the same enrollment numbers and per pupil funding amounts. So how is it that one can go up and the other can go down? Let me provide a little bit of background information before going into the details of explaining this. The slide that's before you here simplifies a series of complex funding formulas down to its basic components: enrollment, per pupil funding amounts, a state share, and a county share. In Maryland, public education is funded through the state school fund, and the box that you see in the middle labeled per pupil funding represents that state school fund. And it's based on major aid programs, and these are just a few of the major aid programs. For each of these programs, there's a required state share and a required local share that establishes the minimum amount of school funding. The amount of the state and county funding for each major aid program is based on specific per pupil funding formulas multiplied by the applicable student enrollment. Unless otherwise defined in law, student enrollment is measured two ways. The first measurement is the actual enrollment as of September 30th of the school year that we're in right now. And then the second measurement is the 3-year average enrollment. The greater of the two measurements is actually used to do the calculation for the required funding. The result establishes the required minimum level of funding that must be provided by the state and must be provided by the county. The required level of funding per pupil has to be maintained year over year. In other words, the amount of funding per student cannot decline year over year in Maryland, and this is referred to as maintenance of effort funding. The minimum level of funding for each major aid program, looking down at the bottom part of this slide, is split between the state and the local government, and it's split on a number of factors such as relative wealth and other factors. The Maryland State Department of Education calculates these required amounts, and the required state share becomes the revenue received from the state, which is the number that we shared with you on the previous slide. The required local share is the amount the county must fund. However, and this is a key point, a county can fund more than its required local share. When a county funds greater than the local share, this increased amount of funding becomes the base that must be maintained each year. This is referred to as the required maintenance of effort funding. In addition to the required MOE, school systems can request the county to fund an amount above the MOE. The required MOE and the above MOE together make the amount of recurring funding that has to be provided by the county each year, and the amount of recurring funding provided in 1 year becomes the basis for calculating the required recurring funding for the next year, or the next year's required maintenance of effort. Consistent with the high value placed on public education in Howard County, the county funding provided each year exceeds the required local share. To illustrate, in FY23, in our most current approved budget, the required local share of funding was $359.6 million. The approved recurring funding was $675.3 million. That's 188% greater, almost 2 times the required local share funding. Therefore, in Howard County, the level of funding is determined based on the required maintenance of effort calculation. The key point in the required maintenance of effort calculation is that it uses the prior year per pupil amount. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more here, going on to the next slide. It's the difference in the per pupil amounts being used that is driving the state revenue up and the county funding down. And so on the slide, you can see here, state revenue, the required money from the state is going up by $27.3 million, about 8.5%, whereas the required maintenance of effort funding from the county is going down by about $24.5 million, or about a 3.5% decline. And the state revenues are increasing because the state revenues are reflecting the new per pupil amounts that are shown in the table on the right side of this slide. And these are the amounts that are established in the blueprint legislation. On the other hand, the required MOE funding is going down because it doesn't factor in the growth that the per pupil funding it requires in the blueprint. Rather, as I explained in the previous slide, the MOE is being calculated based on the prior year funding level divided by enrollment. This math establishes essentially the amount per pupil that the county has to maintain in the required MOE year over year. And because enrollment has been declining, the amount of required funding is also declining. It's important to note that in FY24, it'll be the third consecutive year that the required maintenance of effort decreases due to enrollment declines. In FY22 and in FY23, these declines were mitigated by whole harmless legislation. The whole harmless legislation that passed last year was referred to as House Bill 1450. This legislation states that the whole harmless amount that was used in fiscal year 23 be removed from the MOE calculation for fiscal year 24, and that amount was about $23.5 million. So most of the decline in the required MOE is being driven by the whole harmless legislation. But what's important to note is that the required county funding is declining at the very point when HCPSS needs additional funding to support blueprint implementation. As a result, a large above MOE request is needed so that county revenues can increase proportional to state revenues. For FY24, the above MOE request is $130.5 million. Some may ask, why does the school system need such a large increase in revenue from the county when enrollment is declining? If there are less students, shouldn't there be less cost? The answer is simply no. Let me elaborate on this point by showing the trends in funding since the blueprint took effect. Next slide. When the blueprint was approved, its goal was singular: to make sure that Maryland has a world-class education system for all its students, not just the enrollment growth. This is why enrollment growth can no longer be the way to look at revenue growth needs for Howard County students. HCPSS has to look at the per pupil needs for each and every student to make sure their needs are being met and the blueprint's vision of student achievement for all 57,000 students is being achieved. Fulfilling this vision is why state law changed the required per pupil funding. And we have seen state revenues increasing dramatically since. Looking at the left side of this slide, you can see that in FY23, state revenues grew by 13.7%. You can see the total revenue went from $282 million all the way up to $321 million. And the preliminary estimates from MSDE show that the revenues are going to grow by another 8.5% for fiscal year 24, increasing all the way up to $348 million. All of this growth is based on increases in per pupil funding required by the blueprint. Remember, they're both the calculation of the state money and the county money is using the same enrollment number. So it's not enrollment that's driving the state increase, it's the increased funding. And this increased funding is to meet the requirements for increased teacher salaries, establish the full day pre-K, provide free college tuition to high school students who are becoming college and career ready, among the other requirements necessitated by the blueprint. The dilemma is that the law did not mandate that the required maintenance of effort increase by the same per pupil growth rates. Had the required maintenance of effort per pupil calculation been increasing by the same amount as the states, the required MOE would be much greater. And in turn, our request for above MOE much smaller. To give an order of magnitude perspective on what the required funding could be, looking at the right side of this chart, if you see in FY22, right, which was the year before Blueprint took effect, the required county funding was $628.3 million. FY23 was the first year of implementing the Blueprint, and you can see in the blue section of that bar, the required county funding stayed flat, $628.3 million, and it took legislation, whole harmless legislation, to make sure that that did not decline. But if that revenue grew by the same 13.7% that the state revenue grew in FY23, the required maintenance of effort for fiscal year 23 would have been $714 million, more than the total funding provided by the county last year, which grew by 7% to $675.3 million, which is a very healthy growth rate, but not in sync with the state growth and the per pupil growth that's required in the Blueprint. Further, if the required MOE for fiscal year 24 grew at the 8.5% state revenue growth rate that you're seeing here, the required maintenance of effort for the county in fiscal year 24 would increase to $774 million, almost $775 million. This would make the red portion of that bar that you see at the far right of the screen much, much smaller. In fact, if that grew at the 8.5%, the amount of the above MOE request would be $4.5 million instead of $130.5 million. This is just to illustrate how out of sync the required funding calculations are. The exact calculations of this are much more complex. So I just want to lift this up to illustrate how it's going to, how it's impacting and why it's driving the changes in direction on the state monies versus the county monies. The point we want to leave you with on this technical discussion about revenues is that prior to the Blueprint, required funding from the state and the county grew each year at similar rates. Now they are moving in opposite directions because the funding formula does not mandate the same increased investments per pupil for the calculation of the required maintenance of effort funding. And this helps to explain the reason for the large above MOE funding request that you're seeing from the school system, which will likely need to continue into the future to support the implementation of the Blueprint. With that, Dr. Moderano, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Conforti. To members of the Spending and Affordability Committee, I will end with just thank you for your attention today and appreciate your support and leadership.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moderano and the team from the school system there. I want to open up for questions there. I think we should be able to entertain a few questions before we move to next one. So any question from the committee, please just unmute yourself and jump in. Thanks again.
Hi, Holly, this is Steve Poinot. Quick question for either Dr. Moderano or Darren. Has Howard County over the past 10 to 15 years ever funded at maintenance effort, or has it always been above maintenance of effort?
Darren, go ahead.
I'm almost positive it's been above maintenance of effort nearly every year. I double check that and let you know, but we have such a wonderful relationship. That funding has been most years, if not all of those years, above maintenance of effort.
That is correct.
Yeah. Hey, Holly.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Steve. Holly, Steve Hunt here. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for getting up early in the morning to give us this presentation. I don't know if it's possible. Can you go back to that slide that compared state funding, that very last slide that compared state funding versus county funding as it related to MOE? Because I had a question on that kind of jumped out on me there.
Good morning, Steve. Give me a second. Let me reshare that.
Hey, J-Tab.
Steve, this is not early. I've been up since 4, so no worries.
Okay, thanks, Doc. Appreciate it.
It's good to see you.
You too.
Should be seeing it.
Yeah. So when you look at the county revenue request, it looks like fiscal year 23 is 628 million and change. And looks like fiscal year 24 would be 648. So when you talk about the when you talk about the decrease in MOE, it's not, it doesn't appear to be technically a decrease. It's an increase, just not an increase by as much as what it should be if the county followed the same formula as the state. Is that an accurate statement?
This is where the complexity of education funding in Maryland shouldn't be discussed at 7 a.m. in the morning. To kind of elaborate on this. So looking at the fiscal year 23 bar, the one in the middle, right? You can see the 628.3 million that had to be funded, right? And then the county executive and the county council gave us an additional $45 million of recurring money. That established the new maintenance of effort amount for the future at the 675.3 million. So now when you go to the blue bar for fiscal year 24, you would expect at a minimum, if all enrollment just stayed flat year over year, right? And the funding formulas all stayed with the same exact per pupil amount, that blue bar section for fiscal year 24 should show 675.3 million. But it's actually going down to 648.7 million.
But not to, like you said, this early in the morning, I know we have other things to do, but that 45 million was not technically MOE. That was additional county funding that the county executive, the county council found, correct?
Correct.
Which would not technically impact the next fiscal year's MOE. That's just, and I know traditionally the county has done a very good job of finding additional funding. I know that there was a lot of work with the superintendent to take care of the balance in the health benefit area. I forget the technical name of that, to wipe out that
healthcare deficit. I live it all day.
Thank you.
We're
Yeah, wipe out the healthcare there. That was great work there. So I know there was money found to assist in ramping that down. So it's really, that 45 million is really not MOE, correct?
The 45 million does become maintenance of effort for the next year. When you bring up the health deficit, that's a very good point. The county provided $10 million towards the elimination of the health deficit. That $10 million does not become part of maintenance of effort. But when we receive increased funding, like the 45 million last year, which supported increasing teacher compensation, expanding the pre-K, that amount by law, and this is established in state law, has to be used in the calculation of the maintenance of effort for the next year.
Okay, that makes sense. And Holly, that's just something we'll have to discuss, because my understanding is the previous year MOE is basically the floor for next year. So I'm wondering, why is it 648 million when the new floor has been established at 675? But I don't want to belabor the point, but
I think we understand from the presentation, Steve. We can get into the details as we
correct
get into our discussions. But I had one more question.
I think you broke a little bit.
Yeah, you break it up a little bit, Steve.
So, Holly, can I ask this question while we wait on Steve to come back?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I guess that I'm hearing right. So when we hear the county say, this is a one-time contribution, while I guess theoretically it may be one time in a sense to take care of a particular issue or what have you, say whether that was the healthcare deficit or mental health or what have you, that one-time contribution is still contributing to the sum total that's going to ultimately increase the maintenance of effort total, correct?
So there's a part to that.
Okay.
Leonardo, the part of so technically speaking, if there's a one-time money for one-time non-recurring purpose get into the total funding, then if MSDE approve that to be treated as one time, then for next year's formula calculation for MOE, then that piece will be excluded. So that's based on that condition. However, every year when people look at last year's budget to school system versus this year's request, people only look at the change, right? I mean, this is a good example. If you look at the presentation, you just see the total county funding request versus last year is 109 million, but last year include 2.3 million one time. If you take out that, it's really 111.9 million is really 16.6% increase. So like, but people don't remember that. It's only look at last year, the true money, including one time as a base. So, but in reality, that one-time money coming from a resource that cannot be repeated. So the true ask is actually a higher amount increase for the county's ongoing piece on that there. So that's the second part of this. And the other piece, I think Steve Hunt, you mentioned earlier, I think the school system already got to the explanation there, is if the county leaders, no matter county executive council, they provide above maintenance requirement for that year, and that amount was exceptional MMSD certified one time, getting the base in calculation for next year's MOE. So this MOE next year starting with a much higher base than otherwise would be to calculate. It still result a decrease because it's an enrollment drop. That's why the technically calculate MOE is a lower number than last year council provided one because it's enrollment driven. Yeah.
No, thank you for that explanation, Holly, because my understanding was you could, once you set the floor, it was the floor. I did not know that there was a factor that could make MOE for the next year lower than the current year. I never thought you could go the other way. I thought, and that was one of the concerns we've always had about, you know, what that funding should be, because we didn't want to set a floor that could not be achieved in future years. So, and I appreciate that. I did not know that. So thank you. And obviously thank you to JTAB and Dr. Martirano and Darren for their explanations as well.
Dr. Sun, the budget book, beginning on page 22 in the factors influencing the budget to share with the committee, provides a very detailed discussion on the revenues, and it breaks down the above MOE, the non-recurring, and all of that, so that hopefully it can be seen in a little bit more clear language. This is very difficult to understand, and I really appreciate the committee grappling with it.
And thank you very much, Darren, Dr. Martirano, and the team for the very lengthy and very detailed explanation and additional resources. People should feel free to check. Thank you. Any other questions for our team here from school system?
Holly, this is Steve. My question real quick was, there was some reference to grant funds that were ended and rolled into the base now. Do we know what the number is on those grant funds that have expired?
Darren or Jahantab, would you please take that?
We can
Go ahead, Jahantab. No, that's okay.
We can provide that, and the budget book does detail that as well, and the factors influencing the budget section.
Thank you.
It's primarily related to our school social workers that were funded through a grant through the Horizon Foundation, as well as some of our CARES Act funding, where we want to plan for the sunsetting of those grants as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, if no further discussion, and thank you very much for the team from our school system for joining us this morning and provide great information, very comprehensive. I know people probably still need time to digest, and as we talked about earlier, that this is an important part of overall budget, and it's a beginning of a process. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and thank you for the leadership and collaboration. It is a process, as I've told my board, and we will continue to move forward in such a great way. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
You too. Thank you. So we'll move on to next item on the agenda. So it's about 7:45. So I'll just take a few minutes to quickly take a vote for the first report from the Spending for Advisory Committee this year. That's for Hoku by Design fiscal impact analysis. And as you recall, we met 4 times and 4 different meetings and with DBZ experts and have a thorough discussion. And also last meeting, we also collect the feedbacks and at the meeting additional edits from different members there. So that's already packed into the final report that circulated to the committee as of the weekend. And since then I haven't heard anything. So I'm going to do the roll call for the voting members. But before I do that, I just want to ask one more time, is there any questions before I call the roll? Okay, if not, then I will start alphabetically from the last name. And if your name is called, please just say yes or no, so we have a record. So this is for the vote of the Hoku by Design Fiscal Impact Analysis Report from the committee that will circulate on Sunday. So Todd?
Yes.
Dr. Clinch?
Yes.
Howie?
Yes.
Alan?
Yes.
Dr. Hassan?
Yes.
I think
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. JC?
Yes.
Steve Hunt?
Yes.
Dr. Irani?
Yes.
Jimmy?
Yes.
Barbara?
Yes.
Leonardo?
Yes.
Steve Pointer?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Josh? I think Josh is traveling, so he cannot make it. Okay, and then last one on the list. Thank you very much. I want to just take one moment to thank the DPZ team for provide great information on working with the committee and listening to and explaining different methodologies, very technical, and also provide changes there to their original model and also modify the writing accordingly. So, and also very much thanks to the entire committee for very insightful discussion and different feedbacks that help make the final fiscal impact analysis more stronger and everything actually was very solid there. So thank you very much, and special thank you for Alan, the committee member, to take time and do the final wording style formatting and just to make sure all the narratives kind of read smoothly for the audience. So thank you also very much. So with that, I will conclude that part and we'll move on to the next item on the agenda is a multi-year projection and also preliminary fiscal outlook. So let me pull that on the screen. Adobe. Yeah. All right. Okay, I assume you can see it now. So about this time of the year, just to FYI or refresh your memory, we got quite some information, but it's still not final because we're continue to collect information from state, from revenues collected. That's going to inform the fiscal outlook. But at this point, we have some preliminary information to share with the committee. So in terms of the general fund, that's a county's fund that used to support all services there, including education and 26 other county agencies ranging from public safety to facilities, health and human services, etc. The revenue is diversified, but still 2 big items constitute the majority of that. That's property tax and income tax. The 2 combined represent 90% of the total general fund revenue. The rest are some other taxes, permits, charges, fees, etc. So on the property tax, we actually have some good news to share, not surprisingly. The total assessable base information from the State Department of Assessment and Taxation, called SDAT, was showing the total assessable base before factoring some the credits and rebates there is actually showing a growth of 4.3%. If you look at the graph at the bottom, it's still moderate historically speaking, but it's actually the best in the last 5 years. So it's really positive since this is one of the most important revenues impact general fund there. Specifically, it's impacted by the most reassessed base, that is area 2 to the west of the county, which is in orange color in the map. What happens is in Maryland, every county, 1/3 of property get reassessed by the state. And the increase from 3 years ago for those property get phased in the next 3 years. So the last area 2, for example, the full value increase is a little more than 20%. So that gets phased in. So it's 6.8% per year on average. The other areas are still in the phase in from the prior reassessment. The combined total is 4.3%. So the reassessment data here is a multi-year trend, and we list the county and some other big counties there. So as we just talked about, 2023, the group 2 reassess the full value is 20.4%. Before 3-year phasing, or 6.8% per year in next 3 years there. That's pretty much in line with the state average, which is 20.6%. This is the total reassessment for that group there, that combined residential and commercial. What we learned is that commercial reassessment is actually only 12.2%, which is still good, but left behind residential assessment of 23%. It's not surprising because the housing market has been very strong until recent months there, and commercial base has been lagging because of pandemic and other reasons there. Now, looking forward about property tax, there are a few different components to keep in mind. One is that the housing market, as we just talked about, that has been helping to push a higher or stronger reassessment value that's going to benefit us for 24 and beyond, because Maryland has triennial assessment, and with this 3-year phasing, it's kind of like smooth out the cycle in the housing market. The other thing is to understand is that the net gains will be mitigated by a couple other factors. One is homestead credit is going to grow. What happens is that in Maryland, the county has a cap for owner-occupied property in terms of taxable base increase. So say if your house is in area 2 and value shows 20.4% increase from 3 years ago. So once you do a phasing, it's 6.8% a year. But the county's tax is capped at 5% increase because of the homestead. And as the housing value picked up, the amount that's foregone or capped out will become bigger. So that's going to impact the overall revenue. The other elements is different credits imposed by the county directly. For example, the aging in place credit per CB 52/2022 passed there. It actually loosens some of the eligibility, make it easier to get a tax credit. It also expanded the credit term and increased credit ceiling. As a result, that will likely result in between a few to several $1 million additional revenue foregone. It serves a great purpose, but it just has fiscal implications on that. That will help mitigate the overall tax rate increase there. And obviously, we know the housing market has changed the course in the last few months there. It continued to cool down, and we see some price adjustment, but transaction also dropped significantly. That has implication for future assessment. That's going to change the property tax and some other related taxes or fees or charges there. Commercial base, that's an ongoing concern. Some of the presenters earlier, not today, but other days, there are other meetings here mentioned that once the existing leases expires, and which combined with remote working trend, some of the commercial base might see continuous impact from that. And new construction, as we are aware of, that permits and new construction has been slowing down dramatically because of market conditions and possibly because of some regulation changes in recent years. So on income tax there, it's also strong. Surprisingly, during the pandemic there, what we are concerned is that it may not be sustainable. Historically, if you look back, the county typically have probably around 3.4, 3.5%-ish income tax, tracking the income, slightly below the income growth there. During the pandemic, we have been seeing very strong growth. Firstly, is because surprisingly, it's benefiting from a very big, sizable federal stimulus package there, and also housing market and stocks market was very good for a while. So that transferred into additional capital gains there. And then last year, we were actually all looking at a potential correction. We end up still doing very good, and that's primarily because inflation is unusually high. As of last year, the unofficial number was showing a little more than 7% increase throughout the year. That actually has been pushing up wage growth and holding it as 4.6%. If not because of that, it's actually will likely be flat or even negative growth because of inflation. I want to point out that the wage growth and the overall income tax growth is still below the inflation. So it's just something to think about that. So going forward there, you heard that Dr. Clinch has a very good presentation the other day, and his read and also Maryland's general read of the economy is that we'll likely see a weakening in 2022 calendar year because of the economy, inflation, the potential soft landing, etc. And then follow that should be a recovery and go back to a relatively strong level, which should be about 4% in general. Again, we're talking about trends, so any individual years could be different, but that's a general sentiment regarding next few years. EDA and also other presenters earlier also mentioned that in the county and in Maryland, many places, we still haven't regained employment to pre-pandemic level. So for the county, the total employment as of October last year was still 3.9% below pandemic level. And the group, if you recall, discussed about the potential drivers there, and it could be because of the type of jobs get impacted. It could also be the county's relatively wealthy, so some people can afford one person working, the other stay at home. That's coupled with the problem about the childcare shortage in this period of time. So whatever the reason, the workforce is actually one of the concerns there because we still haven't approached a pre-pandemic level in terms of employment. That actually will be a dragging impact on the future personal income growth there. Other key revenues there, we do have some other tax and permits charges, etc. As mentioned earlier, some of those directly linked to the housing market. There has been seen in recent amounts double-digit increases, some actually even monthly change of 30% decrease or more. So we'll see that weakening likely continue in 2024. So that will be a dragging a negative impact there. State aid, the governor just released his proposal last week there. So it's in general positive for the county. Most aid to the county, it's relatively small in general because we're not the one of the counties receive large amount from the state directly. It's usually flat or very moderate growth, except the highway user revenues. That one actually does have an increase 700,000. So that's really good news. So there's some recovery there. And the state aid also provides some strong support to education entities in general. I think you hear from our school system, the presentation, the state aid to school system is going to be an increase of 8.5% based on preliminary information from the governor's proposal. And I think community college also get a pretty good increase there, but we're still in the process of validate information from different stakeholders there. And last year's budget includes some one-time transfer from other funds and in the general fund that as a last-minute needs that try to satisfy additional changes there. If you recall, we actually the council added some additional dollar go to the school system that was pulled from the fund balance from a couple of internal service funds there. At that point, I still have a little bit fund balance left, and that will not likely repeated or affordable going forward. So overall, if you look at 24, combine the information we just went through, we're looking at continues for the second year, very strong budget growth compared to FY23 likely. Although part of the reason is because we are seeing there that's reflecting an adjusted base, primarily income tax, because last year, again, because of the inflation, unusually high inflation, the income tax performance is much better than originally thought. Just as a result, FY23, we're estimated at a higher than original budget level. If you compare the 24 preliminary revenue to 23 estimate is only 2.9%, which is much closer to historical average there. The one thing I do want to point out is that the it's a very positive and it's great, all great. But as we know, this is not going to stay. And based on the information we just talked about, is a lot of temporary one-time factors there. If going forward, it's more likely to go back to historical trend. So what is the historical level? Before the pandemic, the 3-year average of actual audited county general fund growth is about 25 million, a 3-year average, 37 million, 5-year average. So like 35 to 40-ish probably is a norm. And last year's audited actual revenue growth is 40 million or 3.2%. So given that the long-term trend, at least next several years, more likely go back to the historical trend. And that's reflected in this multi-year projection here. As you can tell that the bottom line is between 3.1 to 3.3% in the next several years, with exceptional 24, which is currently projected 5.6%, partially reflecting the higher than expected performance currently driven by inflation spiked income tax growth there. And the sum of the long-term uncertainties, they're already touched upon by different economists and speakers in prior meeting, is that yes, we are not sure about what's going to happen in economy continuously. And I heard earlier presentation 50 to 50 among economists regarding whether there will be recession or really it's a soft landing. It's very difficult to tell. Housing market and stocks market both have been seeing some tumbling. Again, we don't know whether that's going to continue going worse or like stabilize. And a lot of this has lacked impact on revenue, so not immediately in the current year probably, but it's going to reflect in 24, 25, or even beyond, depending on how everything gets reconciled and reflected in the county's revenue collections there. And new development, we already know it's slowing down, and that could continue because of the market condition combined with legislative actions there. And some of the long-term demographic and housing trends that DPZ presented at the early meetings here are also going to impact the county continuously, including housing types there, including the income and also other patterns that's going to impact the long-term projections there. So how does those very strong projected revenue compare to the expenditure requested from everyone? As unfortunately, it's another year that to show a huge gap. It's basically kind of continued the practice from last year, or maybe last a couple of years there. So even the revenue the growth is almost doubling a typical year's revenue growth. The expenditure request collected from different entities here are almost 120 million higher than that. Again, as superintendent expressed earlier, this is very early in the process. Eventually, we'll work with everyone to bring them into balance, because as a county, we are obligated and by law to balance the budget between revenue and expenditure. Not like federal government, we cannot do deficit budget. We have to balance revenue expenditures there. So that's a mandate there. And as mentioned earlier, that the superintendent already discussed the original proposed budget from the school system there, which is the ask itself is 1.5 times of the total projected revenue growth for the entire county in the general fund there. Another thing, just to refresh people's memory from last year, is we probably have some issues to address in 24. In the last few years during the pandemic, because the difficulty, the challenge to maintain or continue support for different service or even rising demands from the community because of pandemic impact, with the predicted slowdown of revenue at that point there, we actually had to make a lot of difficult choice, including underfunding a few internal service funds for health benefit, for fleet, risk management, etc. Essentially use those fund balance, try to make up for the difference there with actual contribution to those funds lower than actual cost those years there. That continued for a few years there. That cannot be maintained there, and actually some of the funds, their fund balance almost diminished basically. So we have to correct the base. That means that some of those contribution has to experience double-digit increase there just to keep pace with the true cost there. We also have to address some of the backlog, no matter fleet or maintenance of infrastructure there, that actually has accumulatively has been not being addressed for a little while because of difficulty we just talked about there. There's also a salary study in process in the county. The county hasn't been doing salary study for a long time there, and finally has a consultant coming in through competitive bidding, and they're in the process of studying the text, the salary scale, etc. there. It's going to take a little while, but initial conversation appears to showing that there were quite some gaps there. So eventually they will likely transfer some needs for salary adjustment. That could be some additional cost that has to absorb in the next few years there. So multi-year projection based on the revenues projected that was shared earlier, and also thanks to all the entities, the 3 education entities, all the county agency provide us, our budget office, their best effort at this point in terms of multi projection, and everything combined. Again, no surprisingly, starting from 24 and beyond, there's an ongoing gap that continue to increase between the request or projected needs versus the projected revenues there. And that gap, if getting untreated, hypothetically, would accumulate to 1.4 billion by fiscal 2029, which is actually almost entire, equivalent of almost entire general fund budget. And the reason is, one, the revenue project is only averaging close to 3.2% a year in this period of time. Expenditure projection by everyone in aggregate grow by 5.8% on average. So here's the projected revenue and the request expenditure annual increase here. And since school system is one of the big part of the overall budget, so that was listed separated at the bottom. As you can tell, like not only 24 projected projection from the school system, 111.9 million increase from the county from last year's same base. Also, the future years are exceeding projected revenue every single year for the entire county. So that's on the very top line there. So we just talk about the student enrollment, etc. So if you look at the pre-pandemic level versus 2023 level, the enrollment in Howard County school system has been decreasing. So currently it was 2.3% lower than pre-pandemic level. At the same time, the total budget from our school system have increased by more than 20%, including all funds. If you just look at the general fund part, the total increase is 6.3%. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this different math than we just saw from the school system, or is this the same analysis?
It's the same analysis. This is the information from superintendent proposed budget.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So the data is from the school system. We just did a math here.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure we're looking at the same stuff and not a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, and thank you. Yes, and these are all same information from the school system. The difference is, I think, is the superintendent and his team was focused on 24 proposed there. Here we'll talk about the pre-pandemic, so we'll look at what happened in the last 3 years. So this pre-pandemic versus 23 information. So yeah, so in general, the county funding has been increasing significantly in the last few years during the pandemic, even higher than pre-pandemic annual average growth there, despite enrollment change on that, reflecting, I guess, the collected support from the county elected officials there. And also just a kind of reminder that we talked to the committee before that Howard County is, proudly speaking, one of the highest funded school district in terms of per student spending. There's a census graph posted a couple years ago was showing that we are actually among the top 10. At that point, it's number 5 among 100 highest, largest school district in the United States there. And future funding needs there, again, we already talked about the first stage of requested from the school system of county funding increase every year, exceeding the county's own projected total revenue growth in this period of time. But also there's a discrepancy between what state assessed needs in terms of county funding compared to the school's forecast there. So the last line here in orange is state DLS projected needs of the county funding growth for the school system there. So that growth is close to 2% a year. And you can tell like the superintendent's request or multi-year projection is much higher than that. There's also a document, it's one of the attachment actually for the Hoku by Design report, and on attachment 5. It's an attachment that has more details as a source of such information. The state DLS did a study last year called the Local Fiscal Impact of Implementing the Blueprint for Maryland's Future there. Although they didn't mandate anything, they are indicating that Howard County is among 9 counties because year after year have been exceeding the maintenance effort requirement. Then if the county continued the historical practice, at that point it's close to 2%, 1.8%, 2.2% growth every year in terms of county funding to school system, then Blueprint is not going to add additional obligation on top of that to the local governments when it's combined with state aid, which is going to have significant growth every single year. So that's what the DLS projection shows on that. And also we just learned about the governor's proposal, as repeated earlier and confirmed by our colleagues from the school system there. It looks like the county will continue to receive very strong support from the state on our school system, with at this point showing 8.5% growth in the state aid. So seeing the big gap projections there it looks a little bit depressing, but there are ways to make it work, right? This is very early to talk about how, but just throughout a hypothetical scenario as one of the many possibilities to keep revenue expenditure balance there. So I'm just using a hypothetical scenario I call the same service scenario. So if we are just assuming that all the service combined showing a per capita same service, but built in inflation cost growth based on CBO's federal's projection, that's about 2.5% per year, except the next year we might have to see a higher growth there. 2.5% inflation growth for the same cost per person. Then we have a population growth, right? Coming from the prior presentations here, about 0.9% a year in the next several years. So that combined together is close to 3.4%. Then on top of that, we have debt service and retiree health benefit, which is driven by different schedule. Everything combined, we're going to see, based on those assumptions, expenditure growth at probably 3.6%, 3.7%-ish. That's still not exactly match the revenue, but very close if you look at this projection, and some years even to the good. So again, that's just a hypothetical scenario there. In reality, it really requires all the stakeholders to sit down and work together, discuss, and try to find a way to live within means based on realistic revenue base, which is really based on the taxpayers' overall capacity each year, and also try to live with them, but support different competing needs there and support priority of the community there. And every year, obviously, that's going to subject to discussion, collective decision, and by elected officials. Just a quick refresh of the memory on CIP, which we discussed, I think, 2 weeks ago. And as you recall, we also are looking at a very challenging situation when it comes to CIP there, and the request from every entities combined also represent a significant gap when it comes to compared to the bond capacity and other designated revenues there. We are looking at between 118 to 193 million gap each year for capital part as well. And we also talked about limited funding options available after the county has, in the last few years, actively tapping different possibility, and no matter it's more innovative or just find more designated resources there. So we have very limited options left. There's one question I think is from the Steve Hunt, one of committee members, asking about, so what happens to those rate changes, how much additional capacity that freed up? So for the school surcharge, the rate change authorized by the county council a few years ago increased the rate from 1.32% in fiscal year 19 with a phase-in to 7.5% currently. So that's an increase of 476%. So that eventually added, as of last year, about 10 million additional capacity. But that is a gradual because the rate change throughout time there. It's actually not 5 times at the rate. If we talk about the revenue, it's only increased by 186%, which is very significant, but different from rate increase there, because in this time, the market conditions, legislative changes might have been impact the actual development that pays for the tax rate, and also the legislation has some grandfathering or waivers of the new fees for different types of development, like senior housing, I think affordable housing, etc. So the final additional revenue is sizable, but nothing probably close to original rate would suggest there. Transfer tax rate was also increased in fiscal year 2021 from 1% to 1.25%. That generate about 10 million capacity in as of fiscal year 22 attributed to the rate change. And all this does actually provide additional capacity to the CIP. It doesn't mean that we will have more increase every year for CIP, because some are just used to pay historical debt, which otherwise will go to deficit down the road. So now we just have more funding to support some new needs every year, but also to pay historical debt, which otherwise wouldn't be affordable. And we also talked about last time about the borrowing getting more expensive. Our colleagues on finance will talk about that. And we also have to manage overall debt burden continuously, as these are showing some improvement from the previous trend a couple years ago, but continues to see, I think, above our policy ceiling at this point. So we have to be mindful on the overall debt level, and some of the designated CIP revenues, as well as one-time by nature, as well as some of the revenues related to the housing market, all the development there continue to see some setback. So that's one concern when I talk about both CIP and the revenue, and also the operating needs there. And just a kind reminder, since we're talking about the funding in general, the county's income tax rate is already at the maximum level allowed by the state, and the county property tax rate is second highest in Maryland. So just keep that in mind when we talk about the overall revenue capacity as based on the taxpayers' payment every year. The long-term strategies here, again, some of this might be touched upon by my colleagues in finance shortly, is we have to keep and maintain and enhance our fund reserve, because there are still a lot of risks and unknown factors going forward, and they could continue to be significant volatility. Last couple of years is very unusual, and some of those are bubbles driven. So going forward, we still have to be very prudent and get ready for all kinds of possibilities there. We also have to continue to look at how to use one-time investment to get us long-term gains, as well as to continue the strong process in terms of engage the public and a lot of detailed discussion and to gather input and works with everyone, all the key stakeholders, to have candid dialogue and a continued discussion about how to develop some type of realistic multi-year plan or scenarios that match the real revenue streams, and at the same time try to address rising demands for different types of service. We have an aging population to take care of. The young workforces would need help on that. The community is getting even more diversified. There's continued needs on education and higher education, and infrastructure maintenance needs only go up when those roads and structures getting old. So we just have to work together to find solutions that hopefully address the majority of the critical needs there. So that's just my quick presentation. So I can take a couple questions, then I will move on to finance, talk about debt and credit rating. Thank you.
Colleague Todd here. I guess this applies equally or at least equally to the school system, but you mentioned, as did they, that we need to increase salaries of school system and county employees to remain competitive. Do we have positions that are going unfilled now? Is the quality level of the new applicants lower than we want it to be? Secondly, and thirdly, is the net out migration of those employees compromising our ability to deliver services?
So Todd, I will start. I'm not sure I will be able to address all the things. It just mentioned that. I think the quality is hard for me to judge, because different agencies, depending on what had the positions opening and how fast they can recruit and how fast they can assess that, right? But in terms of the challenge of recruitment, I think that's pretty prevailing at this point. Both private sector and public sectors are find difficulty. I think the school system probably in the same boat, find difficulty of filling vacancies quickly with high quality candidates quickly. And that has something to do with an issue that's touched upon earlier in prior meetings, is that the overall workforce participation has been dropping in the county and other places as well. It seems less people are seeking for jobs there, and sometimes there are salary issues there as well, not attractive enough. That's part of that as well. And in terms of the county's salary, this is very early discussion. We really haven't seen the final study results there. That's going to happen in the next between few to several months on that. It just initial conversation with the consultant seems to be showing some gap there. So I don't want to get to the details there, because they're still in the process of making those analysis in comparison to other big jurisdictions in this area. So I don't want to jump on that, but that's certainly pressure. I think inflation probably is part of the factor too.
So to clarify, we don't know if there are unfilled positions, and we don't know if there are fewer applicants per unfilled position than in the past.
I think what we observed, we always have unfilled positions there. The issue is some of those takes longer to fill, and sometimes it's already getting close to fill, and they took other offer and leave. So that's the difficulty we are facing. And recently, actually, I think there are some improvement on that. I don't know why, and maybe HR have been working very hard with department to do that there. But I cannot judge on the quality of the candidates on that without talking with every single department on different type of position. I can only say that these days, like most other employers, it's difficult to recruit.
I guess at some point,
Recruit and retain, I should say.
I guess it's at some point, I think it would be helpful to have data to support the anecdotal claims, because I haven't seen any data or heard any from the schools or the county on this issue.
On teachers not having enough teachers, Todd, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Oh, I've heard tons of anecdotal data about it.
Anecdotal, yes, but I haven't.
Well, I shouldn't say anecdotally. I've heard tons of data about the fact that there are teachers who are teaching right now who are earning their certifications. My daughter, who's right now a senior at Maryland, about to be a teacher, is looking very, very highly at her job prospects heading into the summer because of the amount of openings in all of the school systems that she's talking to. So I guess it's a little more than anecdotally for me, but yeah, there's a tremendous shortage.
And if I can jump in, this is Jahanta with the school system. We've seen a significant amount of retirements and teachers going on the long-term leaves of absences. We've had real difficulty filling positions, and then there's a competition too. I mean, there's not as many. The data on the number of students who are declaring education as a major and are coming out and joining the workforce has significantly declined. And so one of the focuses of the blueprint is really to make the teaching profession more attractive. The overall requirement to bring minimum salaries to $60,000 is a significant piece to really try and level the playing field within Maryland, but also to make the profession more attractive for students who may be thinking about what their career path might be. And we've struggled significantly. Now, locally, we did increase the starting teacher salary this current year to $56,325, which is, I believe, the second highest in the state. And if you looked at the hiring reports that we provided to the Board of Education in August and September, as we were in a mad dash to staff up before the school year started, many of our teachers came from other districts, not necessarily new teachers coming out and joining the workforce. We were able to attract experienced teachers from other districts. But that challenge is going to continue because the requirement to get to $60,000 minimum salary is on all 24 school districts in Maryland. So we'll continue to struggle with that. As far as data and reports go, we'll actually be presenting a human resources report to the board, I believe, at next week's meeting. So as soon as that report is completed and posted, I'll be happy to share that with Holly to share with this group as well.
And is the starting salary for county employees competitive with starting salary with new teachers?
That would be a county government question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no. I know. I it's not just for you, JTAB. I guess it's for the for
the county. It's really comment. Yeah. I don't know how do you compare, because the public safety and the clerks, and they're all different type of jobs there.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, guess like plumbers. How do you compare to a teacher or a policeman? I mean, you have to find similar type of jobs for
Right. I
comparing.
guess I'm thinking of, bachelor's level new employees. Is the county paying 40,000 and the school system paying 56,000 to start? I don't know the answer. I'm just curious. And particularly, can the county actually discriminate or distinguish between new employees that are required for, computer type work rather than Parks and Rec work, for example? I just don't know how that works.
Todd, it's also the difference between 10 and 12-month employees. So remember that.
Right. Which my guess is makes it the spread even more.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I'll defer anything else. Thanks.
Holly, I have a quick question about the cap that you discussed on property taxes and the limit of 5%. Is that a valuation cap, or is that a dollar cap in taxes can only go up 5%, i.e. if we increased property tax rates, would that still be subject to the same 5% cap?
It's a taxable assessment cap.
So if my
for county
taxable
tax
assessment is
Right.
$600,000 and it was going up 5% to $630,000 at a dollar tax rate, that's limited. But if it goes up, if the dollar tax rate was $1.05, that 630,000 would still be the assessable base, and I paid a higher 105 per 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is.
That's correct. It doesn't
Okay.
speak to the tax rate. It's only
Okay.
on
And-
taxable base. And the interesting thing is also that's only speak to the taxable base for subject to county property tax. They're income every year. Basically, if rate
Yeah, I
doesn't
know you can have
change,
other
then
other
assessment.
taxes that
Yeah, the
aren't
state
limited, like
tax, for
trash
example.
taxes,
Right, and the state tax, actually, state property tax, the assessable base
fire
cap
taxes.
is 10%. That's increase is 10%. So when you pay the
Oh,
state
okay.
tax, it's actually capped at 10% because that's a state has their own cap on that. The county piece is 10%, 5%.
Okay. Now I forgot my other question. Okay. You had a slide here that showed the way to avoid the long-term budget gaps, as we look at it, if you will. The fiscal is this here. That $55 million that you have in the growth under same service expenditures, that assumes that we fully fund the school system where we funded them last year at the 673 million plus an increase, correct?
That is correct. It's not
Okay.
it's not separate different entities, just whatever funded in counties last year, we
You
take
did a
it base
4.3%
and then
growth on
put
that.
and would put a essentially 3.4% plus a debt service, sometimes a little higher.
Which would
than
put
that.
us at like 70 something million over maintenance of effort if we did that, roughly.
Yeah, if you do this cross board, like
If you
treating
do the
this
math
as
down
everybody
and
else,
back
then
up,
that's
okay. So,
yes.
but it would miss the funding need that they have by about 55-60 million bucks.
Right, because the overall here is only, the total increase is only $40-some million versus the ask 111 million. Yeah.
Okay. And then and this assumes that, to your point, that every other service goes up by the same percentage, that same 4.3%.
Correct.
Okay. And then we're estimating a $72 million increase year over year in projected revenue to trail down a little bit because, inflation in theory is going to be tamed. We can let Dr. Ronnie and Dr. Clinch burst that bubble, and we'll go back to kind of a normalized growth, but at a higher base.
Right. That is accurate. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the discussion. And again, there's a lot to digest. And then when we actually have the opportunity to talk about recommendation, because the committee will be asked to make recommendation overall forecast for revenue and the multi-year projection next week, as well as the debt. That will be opportunity to continue discussion if people have questions. And I want to switch to finance now because I want to give them adequate time to cover debt. So I don't know whether it's Rafi, do you want to run from your part or your team, or you want me to pull on the screen? Either way will be fine.
Yes, Angie will run it, and I will make the introduction. Hey, Rafi here, Director of Finance. I was trying to unmute. It wasn't possible for me to unmute on time. In terms of the vacancies, we are experiencing quite a few. We have over 17% vacancy. With all of this work we have to do to meet the needs of our citizens, we are struggling. And we've been looking for an IT person now for over almost a year, since we lost the last one. The amount they're asking for is not within our range. So that has been a challenge. That being said, we're here to talk about our credit rating and our debt measures. I do have with me Angie Price, my deputy, and John Vu, the Bureau Chief for Cash and Debt. And John will be making the presentation today. So John, you want to take it away? Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks you guys for your time this morning. As Rafi mentioned, the topics that we'll be discussing are the credit rating, our debt management policy measures and projections, the bond authorization process, and the authorized but unissued bonds. Angie, can we get to next page? Next page, Angie. All right, so the county's credit rating. Over the last 25 years, Howard County has received AAA rating from the three major agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. Since County Executive Ball's time in office since 2019, the team's focus has been maintaining the county's AAA bond rating, which he's done, and allowing us to borrow money at the lowest possible cost. He's also focused on revisiting the rainy day fund investment strategy, and we'll speak to that in a few slides to what the team's accomplished since. Just to give you guys some color to the impacts of having benefits and impacts of having a AAA rating. For example, if we had a $150 million bond sale, our advisor estimated that we would have about $1 million in interest savings over the life of the bonds. Looking at the credit rating criteria, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P each have their own methodology to determine the creditworthiness of their entities rated. Looking at the critical credit factors for state and local governments, they focus on the economy and tax base, finances, management, debt, and pensions. Of the criteria, fund balance is one that the credit rating agencies put a lot of emphasis on. And as I mentioned before, each one has their own methodology, and we can see here the emphasis that each agency puts on the fund balance. Moody's AAA ratings tend to have 30% or higher general fund balance. S&P is only at 15. When we look at the chart on the right, we can see that during 2018 to 2020, we were still below those thresholds, while we still received the AAA rating due to other notching factors and intangibles such as our fiscal management. So looking at that, working with our financial advisor, the county has increased our general fund balance to be more consistent with the median AAA rated entities. And you can see as of June 30th, 22, we have surpassed 30%. So that big part of that strategy is to hit those targets without depending on notches to mitigate any risk of downgrades in the future. Earlier, I mentioned the county's rainy day fund. Our county charter requires that the rainy day fund be maintained at 7% of audited general fund expenditures for any emergencies. The county's always funded the rainy day fund and never tapped into it. One of the key factors that you can see is that we've increased our policy reserve, bumping the rainy day fund plus the reserve to over 10% to be more in line with other AAA rated entities. Moving forward to our debt affordability measures, the first one is debt as a percent of the assessable base. This is both self-imposed and included as part of the rating agency's credit rating criteria. Our charter limits the outstanding general county debt to 4.8% of the assessed value. As we can see, the assessable base continues to rise, and the level of debt has been stable over the last 5 years. In terms of the projections, our current assumptions include $90 million of annual debt issuance at 4.5% interest. This also includes the $75 million WIFIA loan in which we expect to start drawing in FY26. Just to talk about the projections and assumptions a little bit, I recall last year someone asked while we were in that 0% rate environment why we were still using that 4.5 interest rate as an assumption. We can see now in this volatile marketplace that how quickly the rates have risen. We've seen sales and rates be at nearly 4% over the last few months based on other jurisdictions and their sales. So we still take this conservative approach to make sure that we can be proactive in our strategies moving forward. The second measure is debt measured against the population on a per capita basis. This isn't considered by the credit rating agencies, but is required by our debt management policy. This continues to be stable, which really represents that our debt is not outgrowing our population growth. The third measure is per capita debt as a percent of per capita income. This is also no longer considered by the credit agency. That limit of 10% was consistent with the AAA rated counties when added to the policy in 1996. One of the things with this county in particular is that we're the 4th highest rated median income in the nation, and we can see our growth over the last few years where the per capita income continues to increase. So we can attribute that to our educated population and their incomes growing faster than our rate of debt. The fourth measure is debt service as a percent of current revenues. This is an integral part of S&P's credit rating criteria, and it is a self-imposed policy to keep debt service to 10% or less. It's relatively been stable over the last 5 years with some bigger influxes due to the courthouse project. In terms of our projections, we still take this conservative approach, which we'll see in the revenues. But for the most part, we are hovering around 10% and below over the next few years, with some of those big influxes due to balloon payments with our ag land program, which we had issued those IPAs in the early 90s prior to establishing our debt, some of our debt strategies today. In terms of the bond authorization and issuance process, bonds are authorized as part of the capital budget process in May. Each bond authorization is linked to a specific capital project. That authorization is in effect for 4 years, and any unissued bonds may be reauthorized for an additional 4 years or reallocated due to a lapse, and must go through a legislative process to be reallocated. Currently, the county projects that once bonds are authorized, we'll issue about 20% per year. Currently, the county has a short-term line of credit facility to reimburse us for any capital project costs throughout the year. And each spring, we go to our general obligation bond sale to pay off that line of credit. Looking at authorized but unissued bonds, finance collaborates with budget and the Department of Public Works to work with departments and agencies to try to reduce the amount of bonds authorized but unissued through both the budgetary and legislative process. So in these conversations, we look at what's authorized and unissued, what's potentially going to be or need to be reauthorized, and the upcoming debt issuance. And then, sorry about that. In terms of our issued to authorized bonds comparison, on average over the last 15 years, we've actually issued less than what's authorized. Some of those influxes where we see the higher issuance amounts that may be due to refundings or special projects such as that P3 courthouse. If you guys have any questions, you can, or comments, feel free to ask any of us here. And thank you guys for your time.
Thank you very much, Rafael, John, and also Angie. So yeah, we have probably about 10 minutes left there. So for the committee, do you have any questions for our finance colleagues there? And make sure unmute yourself if anybody has a question there. I think you guys did a fantastic job.
Great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And also congratulations for I think not only get to distinguish the AFFOR report, but also for the first time you have the, what's the name again, Rafi? Do you want to brag a little bit?
Yes, the popular annual financial report. The report is condensing the annual audited report, the annual comprehensive financial report, which is about 200 pages, into less than 20 pages, basically to highlight the importance of what people should be pulling out from that big book. If you are not an investor, it's very difficult for you to be going through all of that. But as a citizen, you want to see what are we spending our money on, my taxes on. And I think this PAFRA, as we call it, gives you a quick overview of that. We have our second one now. We've equally applied for the award. It's online. You all can go ahead and take a look. It's less than 20 pages. It's a quick read, but all the information that are critical to what we've been talking about are all contained in that that report.
Yeah.
Thanks, Holly.
Hey, Holly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Steve Hunt here. By the way, congratulations. That's great stuff. Can we go back? I'm just going to put out the age-old question that I know a lot of people have asked, and I figure this is a great time because we've never really, I don't think we've discussed it as part of our committee hearings. It's always come up as we're developing the final report and getting to a vote on bond authorizations for the upcoming year. But I think you know where I'm going to go. The slide, if you could pull it up, of authorized but unissued, because it begs the question, and I'm sure I'm not the only one out there. Maybe I am. I don't know. You know, it looks like as of fiscal year 23, we have just shy of $650 million of bonds that have been authorized but have not been issued, correct?
Yes.
Which begs the question, you know, why this year do we need to authorize more issuance if we've already got, this much already out there that could be issued, and that obviously would knock down the balance of what's sitting out there.
I would try to answer that. The key part there is that we have projects that have been authorized, and these are the bonds that we intend to issue for the ongoing projects. Like John mentioned, our authorized bonds are for only 4 years. So these are projects that we know are ongoing, and some of them take a longer time. The $75 million of WIFIA we just talked about is in this year's budget, but that is not, the project hasn't started yet, because our biggest challenge when we issue authorized bonds is that the legislative process has to take place. The budget process has to take place first before we start the contract negotiation or even issue an RFP, because the money has to be made available through the budget process for the RFP to be issued by our DPW, and then construction starts. And what we've done is that we have tried to keep the short-term facility that John mentioned in one of the slides to fund those projects, and then we issue bonds once a year. We always issue bonds in spring. So there is always a huge lag, more than about a year or so lag. So that's why you see that number. But in that the one you should really be looking at is the general obligation bonds, which is the general fund. All the others is what Harley mentioned in our earlier presentations. Those are the special revenues that we're getting, like the transfer tax. They are specific to to projects that are going to be funded. So, but for the general obligation, that is currently for this year we have $349 million, but they are all spoken for. Part of that is $75 million for WIFIA, and there, of course, there are quite a few other projects.
Okay, that makes more sense, because I look at that, it's a pretty big number out there. But to your point, and I'm assuming, Holly, keep me honest here, that when we talk about bond authorization every year, it's really for GEO bonds. And if that's the case, then to Rafu's point, the ones that we previously authorized, those are already spoken for.
Yeah, I think the charge of the committee was on the GEO bonds, not other, right, because these are driven by different sources. But also for GEO bonds, there are a couple of additional points, which I think Rafi already talked about in general, the process. Another thing is, I think, I mean, John knows better than me but I think you use line of credit to take care of the initial cost, then get reimbursed by issue. But so there's a natural lag in between. You authorize, but then the construction will take some time, sometimes spread a couple of years, and in different stage. Then when need funding, you use cash from line credit, then get reimbursed from GEO bonds. So typically we'll have some lagging anyway between a couple of years to longer, even in the most efficient way. That's just a process going to take.
Just to add to Harley's point, that number for this year, when we issue our bonds for go to bond sale this year, we are probably going to be taking down about $70 to $71 million of that amount. So we are spending the money. It just is not as fast because of construction. That takes time. It's an average of 5 years for the county.
Okay. Todd here. Do I remember correctly? Was it last year or the year before we went through that authorized button issued and cleaned it up? So we removed some authorized bonds that we knew were never going to be issued, so that spread wasn't as large anymore.
I think every year that exercise, the department go through it anyway. When we look at that, we also question them, if you have prior unused fund, do you still need it? And sometimes they will say, because this isn't used and that, there's still, like, just one project, for example, there's a prior authorized of $5 million unused there, and they plan to use that. And then, so as a result, they only need to ask for $2 million next year to finish the rest of construction there. So that's all taken into consideration. And sometimes if a project is finished or our are anticipating lower costs, which is not very likely these days, but then we'll say adjusted, and they will actually have negative number, or use that number to offset what's a new ask on that there. So that exercise is go through by the project managers all the time, and every year when they request that, we actually ask them that question.
Thanks.
No, thanks everybody for that explanation. And by the way, I see that when I look at the P3 bond line, I just recently did jury duty. It was my first time to the courthouse since it was built, and man, that thing's beautiful. Glad we did that.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, and thanks for everyone. And I want to thank again all the speakers today for providing great information, and for the committee for engagement, and also very insightful questions there. With today, I think we pretty much finished all the presentations. Starting from next week, my vice chair Steve is going to take over, because then we will move on the discussion of the recommendations as the charge of the committee to develop a March 1st report for delivery to elected officials there. By the way, the next week's meeting is a little bit different. It's not going to be Tuesday, it will be Wednesday next week on that same time, 7 o'clock on that. So we look forward to all people, or most of you, and participating in discussion. That's going to be very important discussion about as a committee, have going through all those, what's going to be your thoughts regarding recommendation to include in the final report. And thanks again, and have a good day, and look forward to see all of you next time. And thank you.
Thanks, Holly. You too.